The air in Constantinople was heavy with the weight of history. The great domes of Hagia Sophia stood as silent witnesses to the rise and fall of empires. In the heart of the Topkapi Palace, where the scent of burning oud and ink mixed with the salty breeze from the Bosphorus, a young prince prepared to step into the shadow of his ancestors. The empire he was about to inherit was unlike any before it, vast, powerful, and yet, at a turning point. The Ottomans had conquered lands stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the mountains of Eastern Europe, but with great expansion came new challenges. Would this new sultan, the son of the mighty Selim I, be able to hold it together? The empire had seen ruthless conquerors before: Bayezid, Mehmed the Conqueror, and of course, Selim I, the man who had doubled the Ottoman territories in just a few years. Yet, conquest was one thing, governance was another. The empire had grown fast, too fast, and now cracks were beginning to form beneath its surface. Local rulers resisted Ottoman authority, new enemies lurked at the borders, and the internal structure of the empire, though grand, was fragile. The Janissaries, the elite warriors who had once been the backbone of the Ottoman military, had grown restless. The European kingdoms, shaken by Ottoman victories, were already looking for ways to strike back. And in the east, the Persian Safavids remained an ever-present threat. This was the world into which Suleiman was stepping, an empire of opportunities, but also one of looming dangers. Yet, Suleiman was no ordinary heir to the throne. He had been groomed for this moment from birth. Unlike many rulers who ascended to power unprepared, he had spent years studying statecraft, law, and military strategy. Raised in the provincial capital of Manisa, he had governed as a young prince, learning firsthand the art of ruling. He was not merely the son of a conqueror, he was a visionary, a man with ambitions far beyond mere territorial expansion. His mind was shaped by the great Islamic scholars, the poets of Persia, and the legal traditions of the empire. He admired Alexander the Great and saw himself as a ruler who could surpass him, not just with the sword, but with wisdom and justice. As he prepared to ascend the throne, the world held its breath. Would he follow in his father's footsteps and rule with an iron fist? Would he be a sultan of war or one of peace? Would he bring glory to the empire, or would his reign mark its decline? The answer to these questions would unfold over the decades, but on that day, one thing was certain: the Ottoman Empire had entered a new era. And at its helm was a young man whose name, centuries later, would still be spoken with awe: Suleiman the Magnificent. The night was still over Constantinople, but inside the grand halls of Topkapi Palace, the weight of an empire was shifting. News had arrived. Sultan Selim I, the conqueror of Mamluk Egypt and the defender of the Caliphate, was dead. The empire he had built, stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the plains of Hungary, now rested on the shoulders of his only surviving son. The message was urgent: Prince Suleiman must leave Manisa at once. Far from the capital, in the provincial seat of Manisa, the young prince had been governing as a Sanjak Bey, a governor in training. Unlike many heirs to great thrones, he had not spent his youth in idle luxury. He had overseen the administration of his province, commanded armies in minor skirmishes, and learned the delicate art of managing an empire where the stroke of a pen could be as deadly as the blade of a sword. The death of his father meant that everything was about to change. The journey from Manisa to Constantinople was swift but tense. As was tradition, whenever a sultan died, the empire risked chaos. The Janissaries, those elite warriors who had propped up and dethroned rulers before, watched closely. Ministers and viziers whispered among themselves, some eager to pledge loyalty, others uncertain if this young prince would be strong enough to command them. The history of the Ottomans was filled with brutal successions, brothers murdered, power struggles ending in bloodshed. But Suleiman had no such rivals. His father had made sure of that. He was the sole heir, the only one left to take the throne. As he entered Constantinople, the city was eerily quiet. The people waited for their new ruler, wondering if he would be as ruthless as his father or if he would bring a different kind of rule. His first act was a symbolic one. He visited the tomb of his great-grandfather, Mehmed the Conqueror. It was here, in the presence of the man who had taken this city and made it the heart of an empire, that Suleiman silently reaffirmed his purpose. He was not just inheriting a throne, he was stepping into the legacy of conquerors. When he finally took his seat on the imperial throne, the ceremony was grand, yet tense. The viziers studied his face for signs of weakness, the generals measured his resolve. But Suleiman had already made up his mind. He was not merely going to rule, he was going to transform the empire. And he would start by doing something that would announce his reign to the world. He would go to war. Even as he settled into his new role, his mind was already on the west. Hungary, the gateway to Europe, stood defiant. The fortress of Belgrade remained unconquered, a thorn in the empire's expansion. His father had been too preoccupied with the east to deal with it, but Suleiman had no such distractions. His first campaign would be swift and decisive. The world would see that he was not just the son of Selim, he was a ruler in his own right. Within months of his ascension, the young sultan was on the move. He led his armies across the Danube, the banners of the Ottomans fluttering in the wind. The siege of Belgrade began, and unlike those before him who had failed, Suleiman broke through its defenses. The city fell, sending a message to Christian Europe: there was a new power on the throne, and he was not to be underestimated. Back in Constantinople, the court was watching. The Janissaries, who had once questioned his strength, now cheered his name. The viziers who had doubted him now stood in quiet admiration. And across the empire, from the streets of Cairo to the markets of Damascus, a whisper began to spread. The young sultan was not just a ruler, he was a force to be reckoned with. This was only the beginning. The boy who had left Manisa as a governor had returned as an emperor. And the world was about to witness the rise of Suleiman the Magnificent. The ink on Suleiman's ascension decree had barely dried when he turned his attention to the battlefield. Unlike his father, Selim I, whose conquests had largely been focused on the east, Suleiman had his eyes set on the west. He understood that for the Ottomans to solidify their dominance, they needed to break the European defenses that had resisted them for decades. And at the heart of that resistance stood the fortress city of Belgrade, a symbol of Christian Europe's defiance. Belgrade was no ordinary target. The Hungarian stronghold had resisted the great Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror himself. The city, perched on the banks of the Danube, was considered the gateway to Europe. As long as it stood, the Ottomans' expansion into Central Europe was blocked. Suleiman knew that if he wanted to make a statement, if he wanted to be taken seriously as a ruler, this was the place to start. In the summer of 1521, he marched north with an army of over 100,000 men, Janissaries, cavalry, siege engineers, and artillerymen, all hardened warriors trained in the art of war. They surrounded Belgrade, cutting off all supply routes. But unlike past attempts, Suleiman had something his predecessors lacked: powerful cannons, perfected over decades of Ottoman siege warfare. For weeks, the city withstood the bombardment, its defenders putting up a desperate fight. But when the walls finally crumbled under relentless cannon fire, the Hungarian forces knew they were outmatched. The Ottoman troops stormed the city, and by August, Belgrade fell. It was Suleiman's first major victory, and it sent shockwaves across Europe. Yet, the conquest of Belgrade was only the beginning. Suleiman was not content with just one victory, he wanted to push further, deeper into enemy territory. His next target was an island that had been a thorn in the Ottomans' side for centuries: Rhodes. The island of Rhodes was controlled by the Knights of St. John, a Christian military order that had long harassed Ottoman ships and raided coastal settlements. Despite previous Ottoman attempts to conquer the island, the Knights had always managed to hold out. But Suleiman was determined to change that. In 1522, he launched a full-scale siege. The Ottoman navy surrounded the island, cutting off any hope of reinforcements. On land, the Janissaries and elite siege engineers set to work, bombarding the walls day and night. The Knights, vastly outnumbered but fiercely determined, fought back with everything they had. The battle dragged on for months, turning into one of the bloodiest sieges of the time. Suleiman, despite his youth, showed remarkable patience. Rather than mindlessly throwing his men into battle, he allowed his cannons to do the work. Slowly, the fortress walls crumbled. By December, the defenders, exhausted and with no hope of reinforcements, surrendered. But in an unexpected show of mercy, Suleiman allowed them safe passage to leave the island. It was a rare moment in history when a victor chose leniency over vengeance. With Rhodes under Ottoman control, the Mediterranean trembled. The fall of these two major strongholds, Belgrade and Rhodes, proved that Suleiman was no mere successor, he was a conqueror in his own right. But Europe was not finished resisting him yet. The greatest test of his reign was yet to come. In 1526, he turned his attention to the Kingdom of Hungary. At the time, Hungary stood as a formidable power, acting as a buffer between the Ottomans and the Holy Roman Empire. Its king, Louis II, was young but determined to defend his realm. Suleiman, however, was prepared. He assembled an army so vast and disciplined that it struck fear into his enemies before the first battle had even begun. He led his troops toward the plains of Mohacs, where the Hungarian forces awaited. On August 29, 1526, the two armies clashed in what would become one of the most decisive battles in Ottoman history. The Hungarian forces, though brave, were no match for the sheer might of the Ottoman military machine. Within hours, their ranks were broken. The battle was not a prolonged struggle, it was a massacre. The Hungarian army was obliterated, and King Louis II himself was killed while fleeing. With the fall of Hungary, the balance of power in Europe shifted dramatically. The road to Vienna was now open, and for the first time, the Holy Roman Empire faced a direct Ottoman threat at its doorstep. But rather than pressing further, Suleiman chose a different approach. Instead of immediately marching on Vienna, he secured Hungary, placing a pro-Ottoman ruler on its throne and establishing it as a vassal state. It was a calculated move. Suleiman understood that wars were not won by brute force alone, diplomacy and strategy were just as important. By controlling Hungary indirectly, he created a buffer zone that kept the Holy Roman Empire at bay while solidifying Ottoman influence in Central Europe. His campaigns in these early years set the tone for the rest of his reign. Suleiman was not just a warrior, he was a strategist, a ruler who knew when to strike and when to hold back. His victories in Belgrade, Rhodes, and Mohacs were not just conquests, they were statements to the world. The message was clear: the Ottoman Empire was at its peak, and its ruler was not just great, he was magnificent. Suleiman's greatness was not only measured on the battlefield but also in the way he ruled. If his conquests had expanded the Ottoman Empire's borders, his governance ensured that the empire did not crumble under its own weight. Unlike rulers who relied solely on military strength, Suleiman understood that a true empire was built on justice, order, and the rule of law. It was for this reason that he earned the title Kanuni, the lawgiver. At the heart of his reforms was his desire to unify the empire's legal system. The Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, encompassing different cultures, languages, and religions. Without a strong legal foundation, chaos could easily take root. Before Suleiman's time, the legal system was a patchwork of local traditions, Islamic laws, Sharia, and imperial decrees. While his predecessors had tried to organize these laws, no one had undertaken a comprehensive reform. Suleiman did. He ordered the compilation of all existing laws, discarding outdated ones and modifying others to create a clear and consistent legal system. His new laws covered everything, from land distribution and taxation to trade regulations and the rights of non-Muslims. His goal was not just to strengthen the state but to ensure that justice prevailed. Suleiman believed that a ruler who was unjust to his people would ultimately face the wrath of both history and God. One of his most significant reforms was in taxation. The Ottoman Empire had long relied on a system where provincial governors collected taxes, but this often led to corruption and exploitation. Many governors overtaxed the people, pocketing the extra wealth for themselves. Suleiman put an end to this by introducing a structured tax system. Farmers, merchants, and craftsmen all had clearly defined tax rates, ensuring that no one was unfairly burdened. The revenue collected was used to strengthen the empire, funding infrastructure projects, military campaigns, and public services. But taxation was only one part of his reforms. He also focused on governance, ensuring that those in power were held accountable. The imperial court, known as the Divan, was no longer a place where decisions were made behind closed doors by a select few. Suleiman frequently attended these sessions himself, listening to the grievances of his people. It was a rare sight, a sultan sitting in judgment, ensuring that justice was served. His emphasis on justice extended to how he treated his subjects, regardless of their religion. While the Ottomans were a Muslim empire, they ruled over large Christian and Jewish populations. Many empires of the time forced religious minorities to convert or live as second-class citizens. Suleiman, however, followed a different approach. Under his rule, Non-Muslims were granted protection and given the freedom to practice their faith. They paid a tax known as jizya, but in return, they were not forced into military service and had their own courts to settle internal disputes. Suleiman's reforms also extended to the military. The Ottoman army was already one of the most formidable forces in the world, but he understood that discipline and organization were just as important as sheer strength. He restructured the janissaries, ensuring that they remained loyal to the throne and did not become a corrupt, self-serving force. Promotions were based on merit rather than favoritism, ensuring that only the most capable men rose through the ranks. Perhaps one of his most lasting contributions was in education and culture. He established schools, libraries, and centers of learning, ensuring that knowledge flourished in the empire. Science, mathematics, and philosophy were encouraged, and scholars from across the world were invited to the imperial court. This intellectual environment helped the Ottoman Empire remain one of the most advanced civilizations of its time. But despite all his reforms, Suleiman was not naive. He knew that laws alone could not guarantee stability. A ruler had to be vigilant, ensuring that his officials upheld justice. He frequently disguised himself and walked through the streets of his empire, listening to the concerns of his people. If he found corruption, he dealt with it swiftly, ensuring that no one was above the law. His reforms left a lasting impact. Long after his death, the laws he implemented remained in place, guiding the empire for centuries. Many historians argue that it was his legal and administrative reforms, rather than his military victories, that truly made him magnificent. He did not just conquer lands, he built an empire that could sustain itself. And in doing so, he cemented his legacy as one of the greatest rulers in history. Suleiman had transformed from a young prince into a ruler whose name echoed across continents. But what made him truly magnificent was not just the vast empire he commanded, it was the depth of his vision, the strength of his character, and the weight of the legacy he would leave behind. Every great leader is shaped by the trials they endure, and Suleiman's journey was no different. His early experiences had instilled in him a belief that power alone was meaningless without wisdom and justice. Now, as he stood at the peak of his reign, his decisions would define the course of history. His military conquests had already cemented his place as one of the most formidable rulers of his time. The fall of Belgrade, the capture of Rhodes, and the crushing victory at Mohacs had expanded Ottoman borders, but Suleiman was never content with just adding land to his empire. He understood that true greatness lay not in how much territory one ruled, but in how well one ruled it. That was why he did not simply stop at military campaigns, he sought to build an empire that was just, prosperous, and cultured. The imperial court of Suleiman was unlike anything the Ottomans had seen before. It was not just a place of politics but of intellect, art, and strategy. Poets, scholars, and architects thrived under his patronage. He himself was a poet, writing under the pen name Muhibi, and his verses reflected his philosophy on life, love, and power. His deep appreciation for knowledge and culture led to the flourishing of Ottoman art and architecture. The empire was not just a military force, it became a center of civilization, drawing influences from Persia, Arabia, and Europe. Yet, even in his glory, Suleiman was no stranger to personal struggles. The burden of rule was a heavy one. He had outlived many of his closest friends and allies, including his first Grand Vizier, Harghali Ibrahim Pasha, whose execution had been one of the most painful decisions of his reign. Ibrahim had once been his closest confidant, his brother in all but blood, yet politics and ambition had driven a wedge between them. Suleiman knew that ruling an empire meant making impossible choices, but that did not make them any easier. His family, too, became a battlefield of its own. The power struggles between his sons mirrored the very conflicts he sought to suppress in the empire. His beloved wife, Hurrem Sultan, had been his most trusted partner, yet her influence in court politics created rifts that could not be mended. The rivalry between his sons, particularly Mustafa and Selim, would haunt him in ways even his greatest battles never did. Despite these personal and political storms, Suleiman never wavered in his vision. His legal reforms had reshaped the empire, ensuring that justice prevailed even in his absence. His administrative changes meant that future rulers would inherit a system that could sustain itself. He had created something far greater than an empire, he had created a legacy. But even the greatest rulers are not immune to time. As the years passed, Suleiman felt the weight of age pressing upon him. He had spent his life in service of his empire, and now, he began to sense the approach of an ending. Yet, he did not retreat into the comforts of his palace. Even in his old age, he led his armies, refusing to rule from behind the walls of Topkapi. His final campaign, the siege of Shigetvar, would be his last act as a warrior, but by then, his name had already become legend. Suleiman the Magnificent was not just a conqueror, not just a ruler, but a symbol of what the Ottoman Empire had aspired to be: powerful, just, and enduring. And though his reign would eventually come to an end, the world he shaped would live on long after him. Suleiman's reign was more than a chapter in Ottoman history, it was the beginning of an era that would define the empire for centuries. He was not merely a conqueror who expanded borders, nor just a ruler who sat on a throne issuing commands. He was a statesman, a strategist, a poet, and above all, a visionary who understood that power alone was not enough. To truly be magnificent, one had to leave behind something greater than conquest, one had to build a civilization that would endure. By the time he had established himself, the Ottoman Empire was at its peak. His military campaigns had pushed its borders deeper into Europe, secured its hold over the Mediterranean, and reinforced its dominance in the Islamic world. Yet, more than the lands he won, it was the empire he strengthened from within that solidified his greatness. His legal reforms ensured justice for his people, his architectural projects left behind marvels that still stand today, and his support for knowledge and culture created an empire that thrived not just on the battlefield but in art, science, and governance. But for all his successes, Suleiman's reign was not without its tragedies. The losses of those closest to him, his most trusted vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, and his beloved son, Mustafa, left wounds that even time could not heal. His later years were marked by internal conflicts and succession struggles that foreshadowed the difficulties the empire would face after him. Yet, even in the face of personal grief, he never abandoned his duty. As he marched on his final campaign, the siege of Shigetvar, he did not know that he would never return. He had spent his life building, leading, and fighting, and he would die as he had lived, as a warrior and a ruler, always at the front. His death marked the end of an extraordinary reign, but his legacy endured. The Ottoman Empire would never again see a sultan quite like him. Suleiman's era was not just a reign, it was the start of the Ottoman Golden Age. His vision, his laws, and his conquests shaped an empire that would remain one of the most powerful forces in the world for centuries. And long after his time, when the empire itself faded, his name remained, echoing through history as the ruler who had not only conquered lands but had also conquered time itself.